A Taiwanese delegation is heading to China to try to push for the reopening of tourism links. The delegation is from Taiwan's outlying islands of Kinmen, which are just a few kilometers off the Chinese coast. Louise Watt is following the story for us from Taipei. Louise, why is Kinmen sending this delegation now?
Kinmen is close to the Chinese coast and it's particularly dependent on China for trade. And after more than 3 years of no Chinese tourists, they want them back. Now, a delegation headed by officials from Kinmen's local government with a whole load of representatives from tourism in tow, they're heading to Beijing. And tomorrow, they're expected to arrive this afternoon, but tomorrow, that's when the meeting takes place. They're expected to meet with the head of the Chinese government agency that's in charge with relations with Taiwan. Now, China stopped its citizens making visits as part of tour groups to Taiwan in 2020. Those restrictions are still largely in place, and the delegation says it wants to press Beijing to allow Chinese tourists to come back to Kinmen as soon as possible. And Kinmen's legislator, Chen Yu-jen, she's also part of this delegation. She says that she hopes that Chinese tour groups will be allowed back to Kinmen before China's big holiday, the National Day holiday in October. That's when millions of Chinese travel. Now, Chen, she is the legislator of she belongs to the main opposition party, the KMT, and she says that she wants to revive ties between the two sides after a series of incidents in the waters around Kinmen that have brought ties between Taiwan and China worse than they already were. In one example, 2 Chinese nationals were killed in a chase with the Taiwanese Coast Guard. Taiwan recently handed back their bodies to China, and China then released some fishers that it had been holding in detention. So Chen says she wants to build on this positive momentum in relations, in her words, to get tourists back to Kinmen.
And so, Louise, why is Kinmen pushing for Chinese tourists to return rather than Taiwan as a whole?
Well, China and Taiwan have had restrictions on tourist visiting. That's because of the pandemic, and it's also because of the general poor state of their relations. Well, Taiwan last year, it did lift some of its restrictions on Chinese tourists visiting. It's already called on China multiple times to allow its tourists to visit Taiwan. But so far, China has only allowed some tourists to visit another group of outlying islands, Matsu, and they saw the first Chinese tour groups in several years visit in June. So Kinmen, like Matsu, it's geographically close to China, and it has lots of family links. But being that close, historically, it was on the front lines of conflict. Back in the 1950s, it saw intense bombardment from Mao Zedong's Chinese forces. And today, people in Kinmen see themselves as close to China, not just geographically, but also as a bit of a political and cultural go-between. They depend on China for trade. Tourism is a big part of that. So they'll be hoping that this delegation's trip to Beijing helps bring back some of the tourists that have been missing for the past few years.